Namaste, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion today on this important topic of supporting LGBTQI communities on campus. LGBTQI plus stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersexed, and others, including allies. While we recognize that this may not be a complete list of sexualities and gender identities, for this discussion, we will be using this acronym, which for our purpose today will include all gender and sexual diversities. I would like to begin today by introducing Mr. Scott Ticknor, Deputy Consul General. Mr. Ticknor joined the US Consulate General Mumbai in September 2020. Previously, he was the senior advisor to the President on the Corporate Council on Africa, and he also served as the acting special representative for commercial and business affairs in the US Department of State's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, where he advocated on behalf of US business interests abroad, promoting entrepreneurship and innovation, and protecting intellectual property rights. Mr. Ticknor has served in various senior level positions in Africa and in the Africa Bureau, and was the political economic chief at the US Consulate General Mumbai in the early 2000s. Before that, he served in Bangladesh, Cameroon, Ghana, Nicaragua, and Spain. Mr. Ticknor is a recipient of multiple Superior Honor Awards and the 2017 Political Advisor of the Year Award, and he speaks French, Spanish, and Portuguese. He received his Master of Arts degree from the University of Michigan and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the College of William and Mary. Mr. Ticknor, I welcome you to our panel today and request you to please address our audience with the opening remarks. Thank you.
There we go. Unmuting is always helpful. Thank you so much, Tiraj. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure I'm on. Well, listen, good evening, good morning for those in the United States. Thank you for joining this discussion. Discussion aimed at fostering a culture of inclusion for the LGBTQI plus community at higher education institutions. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to address what I believe is going to be a critical component, or is a critical component, of human and civil rights today: rights and needs of persons from the LGBTQI plus community. Unfortunately, across the world, LGBTQI plus individuals face discrimination in nearly every aspect of their lives, be it in education, at the workplace, or when attempting to access healthcare or housing. Often these discriminatory practices are upheld through laws that criminalize private, consensual same-sex relationships and marriage. According to a 2020 report by the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, 70 countries criminalize same-sex relationships. The death penalty for same-sex relationships is either allowed, in quotes, or there is evidence of its practice in 11 of these countries. In more than half the world, LGBTQI plus individuals do not benefit from protection against workplace discrimination. Most governments deny trans people the right to legally change their names and gender from those assigned at birth. The study further indicates that 1/4 of the world's population believes that being a member of the LGBTQI plus community should be criminalized. Another study, this one a joint effort among the Boston Consulting Group, the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and the Pride Circle Foundation, revealed that 2/3 of students from the LGBTQI plus community have faced discrimination on college campuses across India. The study further highlighted that among those students, 92% faced discrimination in the form of mocking, 59% were subjected to bullying, and 26% faced social exclusion. 36% of these students reported that they did not come out because they felt their fellow students were not LGBTQI plus friendly. Furthermore, only 21% of those surveyed felt comfortable sharing their identities. That number dropped to 14% at colleges without support groups on campus. These figures together illuminate a single important takeaway. A hostile LGBTQI plus climate on campus leads to negative consequences for student learning, graduation rates, and mental health and wellness. Despite these discouraging statistics, there is hope. In the United States, research has shown that college support groups can be effective drivers of LGBTQI plus inclusion on campuses. The Trevor Project's 2021 National Survey on LGBTQI plus youth mental health tracks the experiences of nearly 35,000 LGBTQI plus youth in the United States. And the research showed that those who had access to spaces that affirmed their sexual orientation and gender identity reported lower rates of attempted suicide. That evidence points to concrete solutions all school administrations can implement. Campuses can reduce inequities experienced by LGBTQI plus youth by ensuring that students have access to a support system and counselors with expertise in addressing their needs. The US government is working to further promote queer inclusion at home in the United States. On his very first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order that highlighted the importance of LGBTQI plus rights and committed to being a champion for LGBTQI plus people. This commitment is being put into action. To cite just two examples, in June 2021, the US Department of Education issued a notice of interpretation that Title IX, an existing law that prohibits discrimination in education on the basis of sex, also prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And last June, the White House announced that the US Department of State would begin the process of including a non-binary gender marker and modernizing existing requirements for updating gender markers on United States passports. This policy affects millions of individuals in the United States, including an estimated 1.2 million non-binary adults, 2 million transgender people, and as many as 5.5 million people who were born intersex. In October 2021, the United States issued the first US passport with an X gender marker. In India, our consulate staff and Education USA advisors regularly provide information about resources and support available on US university campuses for international students from the LGBTQI plus community. LGBTQI plus Indian alumni of US universities, such as the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, have shared the benefits of their college experience and information about support services offered to LGBTQI plus international students at US universities. Our college fair last November included breakout rooms specifically designed to address questions about safe spaces on campuses for LGBTQI plus persons. Over the past 8 months, the US Consulate General in Mumbai has advocated for LGBTQI plus inclusion through our outreach efforts not only to youth and influential leaders in the community, but also to more traditionally conservative business leaders and corporate chambers. Our 9-part discussion series called Beyond the Binary, has, we hope, helped reduce stigmas associated with the LGBTQI plus community by sharing practical information on increasing legal rights, intersectional identity, and understanding the Hijra community. Earlier this evening, we partnered with the Confederation of Indian Industry to promote private sector inclusion of LGBTQI plus employees in India and customers as well. The State Department's Special Envoy for LGBTQI plus rights moderated the panel discussion featuring Indian firms at the forefront of LGBTQI plus inclusion. You'll be hearing today about how other universities and colleges have sought to create inclusive campuses. Ultimately, however, today's program is about your campuses and what actions you can take to create safer, more welcoming, and more diverse environments. Thanks to our panelists tonight, and thank you all for joining. We sincerely hope that you will log off tonight having learned something new, and maybe even feeling inspired to take action that will ultimately benefit all students. Thank you again. And now back to Dheeraj.
Thank you, Deputy Consul General Scott Ticknor, for these words and for actually setting the tone for our discussion today. Before we begin, just a few ground rules for our attendees. This meeting is being recorded, and we will share a link of the recording after the event, both as a reference and a resource for all of you, including our other registrants who can't make it here today. During the webinar, all of you are encouraged to ask your questions using the question and answer feature of Zoom at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to pose your questions, and we'll try and address as many of them during the question and answer section after the panel discussion. India's Supreme Court passed a historic judgment in 2018, overturning a 19th century ban on homosexuality. Since then, in India, we have been much more open in embracing gender, sexuality, and sexual orientation. Having said this, many youth today are still in denial about coming out to their friends, families, co-workers, and social connections. Most Indian families in the metro cities especially show support to the LGBTQI+ community until one of their own family members comes out. Family and friends are then in denial, and the struggle begins. Youth from the community are often made fun of by their peers and are also bullied and blackmailed. As a community, we should support creating structures for an inclusive and welcome community for all genders and sexual identities. Keeping this in mind, let's meet our panelists today, who are active practitioners and activists in the field of inclusivity in higher education in the United States and in India. Our first panelist for this evening is Dr. Jen Self. Dr. Self are the CEO at Brick 13, a critical equity educational consulting firm. They are an assistant clinical professor at the University of Washington's School of Social Work and have coached, educated, and developed leaders across varying organizational spaces, though higher education has been their home place. They began working with the LGBTQI+ students as a graduate student at the University of Oregon in the mid-1990s, where they were the coordinator for educational and support services for LGBTQIA+, as it was called then, students. They helped create and found one of Oregon's first LGBTQ youth support groups, one that still operates till date. Later, they founded and directed the University of Washington's Q Center, an intersectional racial justice LGBTQIA+ center, which they led for 17 years. Welcome to our panel today, Jen. Our second panelist for this evening is Mr. Bruce Smale, Director of the LGBTQ+ Culture Center and Special Assistant to the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Multicultural Affairs at Indiana University, Bloomington. Mr. Smale's career spans almost 30 years and includes experience in social justice, diversity, and advocacy in the fields of higher education and not-for-profit management. In addition to his current position at Indiana University, Smale's higher education leadership experience included key positions at several leading education institutions in the US. He received his MA in Counseling and Personnel Services and a BA in History from the College of New Jersey. As a queer, Black, partially deaf Caribbean man, Smale uses his multiple identities to address social justice through intersectionality. His passion for his work is rooted in giving back to several of his communities. Welcome today, Bruce. Our third panelist for this evening is Dr. Dhiren Borisa, Assistant Professor at Jindal Global Law School. Dr. Borisa is a Dalit queer activist, poet, and urban sexual geographer. Besides teaching at Jindal Global Law School, he is also an honorary visiting fellow at the School of Geography, Geology, and Environment at University of Leicester in the United Kingdom. Dhiren attended his doctorate from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, on queer cartographies of desires in Delhi. His research engages with sexual mappings and making of cities from an intersectional and decolonial lens, both among queer spaces in India and in the diasporic queer worldlings. Welcome today, Dhiren. I will again be a host for today. My name is Dheeraj Mehra, and I'm the Director for Initiatives in India with the University of Notre Dame, situated in South Bend, Indiana. I will be moderating our discussion, and I'm both honored and excited to be given this opportunity to help chart the next 75 minutes with our three panelists and all of you. We have also made a provision for an Indian Sign Language interpreter, Ms. Shreya Soni, who will be translating for us today. You may view both the active speaker and the interpreter by changing your Zoom session settings. Now let's start with our discussion. I'm going to start by inviting Jen Self to open our conversation. Jen, if maybe you could help answer the first question of the day, which in my opinion is going to help set up the next 75 minutes of our discussion. In your opinion, what does an LGBTQI plus friendly campus look like? And what are the key requirements to create and maintain such a campus, both at a private as well as a public higher education institution?
Hi, thank you. I was thinking about that, and what we're really talking about is culture change. And so if your culture change takes place at the micro, macro, and meso level. And so when we think about that, that means that on a campus, we need to see interventions that happen at all of those levels. So at the macro level, that looks like policies in place on universities that actively intervene and affirm and create space for LGBTQIA plus students, faculty, and staff. So that's things like as simple as creating gender neutral restrooms, creating such that students can have their names when they change them on their diplomas, domestic partnership benefits. These are the kinds of things that we have to work for to get past, to make sure that we protect all of the folks that work at our universities. At the meso level, things like student groups, faculty organizations that provide support and care, and spaces where LGBTQIA plus faculty and staff have places where they can go and be with each other and hang out and see other people who are like themselves. I heard the statistics, that people feel isolated. So having a space where you can see and be with other people who are like you is really important. And at the micro level, things that intervene with folks about their own internalized identity and interpersonal concerns. So that's like having great mental health interventions, counseling, and mentoring, and available to students, and also available to faculty and staff. So mentoring for LGBTQIA faculty and staff is critical, and we tend to, I think, forget about that our sexuality and our gender actually really impacts who we are in the workplace as well. It's not just about whether or not we can talk about ourselves. My queerness, who I am, it impacts how I think about my life. It impacts how I do my leadership. It impacts just the way I think about the world. And it's impacted my career trajectory. And so being able to have mentors that are out and open and able to help guide my career has been really critically important to me. So it's really every aspect of the university we need to be able to see change at all of those levels.
Thank you, Jen. I think that was an interesting way to look at it from all levels of the organization. When we look at it both personally for each individual as well as organizationally and everyone and everything in between. I'd like to ask Dhirendra the same question from the Indian perspective. Dhirendra, I know you've been involved in these activities since you were a student and are still actively involved in ensuring we have these safe spaces on campuses. Maybe if you could just help us with your viewpoints as well about the same question about what are these key requirements to create and maintain LGBTQI plus friendly campuses.
Thank you so much, Dheeraj, for inviting me over and hearing me out. I spent a large chunk of my student life in a public university. And because the second part of the question dealt with public and private university, one thing I felt that given the accessibility to education that public university offers, there's a larger diversity of students that we see. I currently teach at a private university, but having said that, while I was a student, often one would realize that teachers who would otherwise teach in your classrooms about cultural hegemony and Gramsci would often also ask you while you're walking around in the campus, how are your animal rights going? Or, hey, LGBT, how are you doing? And you would wonder, what are we missing out? Is this the space? And especially given that a lot of us who come from smaller towns or say for the first time in their life feel a sense of freedom or an escape from the familiar control to go to another city and higher education institute, study there, would enter into these spaces where one would feel absolutely alienated. So I agree with what Jen just said, that we need to think about this world's, that, can we have a space where of whoever I am, from the various walks of life that I come from, where my sexuality is being affected by my other social identities, am I able to survive that space? Am I able to claim it in a similar fashion that like everybody else is able to? Is it equitable? And I feel, so on one hand, you don't want instances of bullying happening. You don't want instances of homophobia being practiced by faculties, by institutions, or administrators, etc., fellow students, or other actors within the academic institution. You want to also make sure that there are formal and informal redressal mechanisms out there, that in case something like happened, where should I go? Where can I share what I am going through? Is there something in the policy where I can reach out? Are there people from my community in a peer network where I can share my experiences without being scrutinized? Because often we can't go back to our homes and tell our parents what we are going through. There might be so many of us, especially in Indian context, where sexuality does not necessarily work in identitarian frameworks, where how does one cope with this doubleness of life? Not necessarily having to visibilize oneself, because there are risks of visibilizing oneself, but also simultaneously able to live a healthy, dignified life. So what are the key requirements? I think intention is much necessarily. Intention for a dialogue, the readiness to exchange with new ways of thinking, to imagine that a classroom has so many diverse people in it, and all of them come with richness of history, questions, troubles. And are we able to create the dialogic space, a possible space where we can not just be, but also become?
I think I loved your closing line, be and become. And you hit upon a very key point when we really consider this about when you go through an experience, where is that safe space and where is that slot where you can actually share what you're going through and find the support. Which leads me to another question, and I'm going to invite Bruce to help answer this. Bruce, if you can just help us think, and how do we address this issue of safe spaces at institutions, not only for students, but for faculty, students, and others within the framework of the institution itself, so that they do not really feel discriminated against or feel bullied? Maybe if you can help share some of your views and your experiences about this.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me as a guest today. And I wanted to kind of begin by mentioning what the Deputy Consul began in terms of talking about sort of the current situation in India in terms of college students, et cetera. So one of the things that I would say is that you do have some level of research that's already out there that indicates some of the challenges or the impact that folks that are LGBTQI are experiencing. So I think on a college campus, one of the things, and Jen kind of mentioned this initially, is we need to really look at this from an institutional standpoint. So have we developed institutional policies that basically supports inclusion or inclusion of LGBTQ plus folks is one area. The other area too is how do we hold people accountable on college campuses? You know, in the US, many of our schools have sort of anti-bias teams or under that framework, you know, if people are doing anti-LGBTQI things, they're usually consequences, follow up, you know, investigations of what's happening on college campuses. So I think having sort of an anti-bias team is another way. You know, many of our centers in the US that are LGBTQ plus centers also focus on kind of safe zone trainings to help the campus understand how to support the LGBTQI community. This goes from conversations around LGBTQI 101, gender identity, sexual identity, how to be an effective ally. All of those types of training actually help build a better understanding on a college campus. The other thing that I would strongly encourage, and based on some of the statistics that I heard, it's arguing or advocating for some level of a department for the campus. I'm at Indiana University. Our center has been here for like 27 years. You know, many of the college campuses do have centers, but those centers provide a lot of support for students, faculty, and staff. For example, students that may be dealing with a crisis on campus, they can basically come to the center. The staff will help advocate for some of those issues, you know, or someone may need some counseling or support or figuring out the system. That's what those offices are really for. The other piece that our offices really do on a big scale are educational programs. So not only are we supporting the community, we're also supporting the campus in how the campus understands and supports the LGBTQI community. So I would encourage some of those as programs initially to consider having in this situation, because I think when you do stuff like that, you'll also kind of create a campus where even if someone is bullied or discriminated against, they feel like they can have some level of support from an office, from a department. The other thing that I would say is that sometimes people tend to look at these centers and say, all LGBTQI folks need to just go to that center. We have no responsibility. The issues of LGBTQI students is actually an entire campus issue. So it's important that the entire campus is really thinking about, in my office, how do I support the LGBTQI community? You know, Jen also talked about what are we doing in terms of bathroom situations that are sensitive to the trans, non-binary communities as well, you know, or just other areas within the community needs to be addressed as well. So it's really about getting the campus to really see LGBTQI students as their responsibility as well, and that as a whole, we need to figure out how do we support all of the intersections of gender and sexual identities.
Thanks, Bruce. I think, Bruce, you brought up some very interesting points. You mentioned policies, you mentioned inclusion, you mentioned accountability, and I think most importantly, you mentioned the entire community. The entire campus really needs to work together to ensure these safe spaces or, you know, a vibrant community that is supportive of each other. And a very important part, I think, of creating these safe spaces is support groups, both, you know, within campuses as well as within communities. And I'd like maybe Dhirain to give us his inputs on this. But how are these support groups? How do you really create or maintain a support group for LGBTQI plus communities in an institution? You know, should it be a queer center managed by the university? Should it be a club run by students? I'm sure both have some pros and cons, some drawbacks, as well as some, positive points. Maybe you could shed some light on, what is maybe not the right way, but in your opinion, a good way forward in creating these spaces.
Most of the queer support groups that we know of in India are student run, and with student-run groups, that one problem that we often face is that they run out of energy as soon as some students who initiated those campaigns, who participated, formed those groups, they pass out of the university space. So one thing that is often worrisome is the futurity of these support networks. So in that respect, an administration run, an institutional center seems more effective. But what I also feel is that in individual capacity, none of them can actually work. They will have to work in unison with each other. We also want to ensure that a lot of students who all want is an informal space, a space of sharing, a space where I can go and say, I have a crush on my classmate, a space where I'm going through a heartbreak. It's a Valentine's Day month after all. Or if one is not able to share in all complexity with administration, should have that informal network. So I as somebody who was part of a queer group, we collectively started one when I was a student at JNU called Dhanak. Before it, there used to be a queer group many years back called Anjuman, but as soon as the students of Anjuman passed out, it became defunct. There was a huge vacuum, then we came in, then we left out, and there's a new group right now. Now, how does one ensure that these groups don't fizzle out, but are also equally able to raise voices of change, are able to, some of us at least, are able to, who can afford visibility, who are not materially constrained in terms of visibility, are able to go and share to the administration, ask for redressal mechanisms, go there, is there, so for instance, in lack of an institutional setup where there's literature, where there is the possibility of not just limiting support networks to students or to faculties, but also cognizant of the power hierarchies that are existing within the system. Say, think about the bottomest end of what constitutes a university space, the sanitation worker, or the working class people, informal workers who have been employed by the university, and they can also be queer. Can we have a scalar engagement with which can then also be able to relate with all of these parallel questions that we are struggling with? What would this support network be like? More than a social bubble, but a possibility for change. And that transition can only happen if you have something which is institutional. So in the equal opportunities cell, there's a policy framework which protects you. And there is a student-run group, which is also autonomous, not deeply tied with it, is able to question the institution if it is falling short. Given changing political grammar, who is the vice chancellor, who is being employed, you might not be able to have the similar changes just depending on if there is a center. The center might be defunct, might not be able to serve its purpose if it's not also being able to read and respond to what other members of the university complex actually need and are desiring.
Yes, I think the key, reading and responding, what you mentioned, reacting is essential when you want to bring change or you want to bring a dialogue. And it's not only about, what I am going through, but also about how someone else is supporting or reacting or responding to a person's positive or negative experiences. Bruce, maybe if I could ask you to give us your take on the same question about how are these support groups created on campus, and what are the pros and cons if they're administrative led or if they're student led. If you can share some of your views as well as your experiences in this.
Sure. Well, as you know, I'm actually leading a department. And so what I would say is that in the US, many of these centers actually began from student protests. So there was a movement among students to say, hey, we want to create space for us. We need this, and so some of the centers actually went from student organizations advocating for departments, and then departments actually were created. I think you need both student support as well as faculty support, and then you also need a department. For me, the benefits of having a department is you're building the infrastructure in the university to say, we are committed to LGBTQI community, and that what we're doing is we're putting resources in terms of professional staff, usually staff members that have counseling background or some level of advocacy to be able to support sort of students' crisis intervention or referral to counseling center or addressing mental health issues, or advocating for policy issues. We can't do this without a department. So, I mean, it's a little bit more difficult to do it without a department. Student organizations are real critical. Students have a different kind of voice. Their voice of protest or their voice of saying these are student needs that we need or the support that we need really creates a different level of advocacy on a college campus. Students sometimes do not realize how empowered they are or how empowered they could be. And as a center, having strong student organizations advocating for issues and then departments also advocating for issues, I think you have a greater chance of creating a different environment for the campus. The other thing too, student organizations could build different kinds of communities than a center. A center still has guidelines around, I'm within a department, I'm within the division of, in my case, diversity, equity, and multicultural affairs. So it makes it a little bit difficult to kind of argue against my division if there are problems, but students can take on some of those challenges as well in terms of advocating for themselves. We can also support them in terms of giving them advice in terms of how do you maneuver within the system. So long answer, I guess, but the short answer is I think we need both, and both are definitely necessary.
Yes, I think both you and Dhiren came up with two aspects. I think it's important, as you said, both of you said, for the student voices, but also the institutionalization and the support, and the organizations themselves need to show that this is something important for them, and that's where the institution itself also comes in. Jen, I'm going to ask you to maybe give us a brief, your brief views on the same, important topic about creating these support groups on campuses, but also maybe, with your experience, if you could also share along with that some best practices as well as challenges that you have personally faced in supporting LGBTQI plus communities at your own institutions that you have worked with. And maybe if you could also suggest to our audiences some easy first steps, easily implementable first steps as well. I know it's a long question. I know there's several parts of it, but I think this is a key point in this discussion, a crux point in this discussion, and I wanted to make sure that all three of our panelists have their own say within at this juncture. Thanks, Jen.
Right. No, thank you. I appreciate that. So students, I think student voice is critical. And depending on the institution, depending, I think, on the climate at the institution, I think that students actually can make or break what happens at that institution. So like, let's just take Seattle, for instance. Seattle regionally in the United States is a place that has just had more acceptance than other places in the United States around LGBTQIA folks when at a particular time in this country. And so when we started the center there, it was easier for me to do that. But we had other difficulties that maybe other campuses didn't. And so the student voice there was louder when we started, and it enabled us to get a pretty good big start. Like, students were very out and open and active. And it enabled them to push forward for some of the policy changes that we really needed to have happen pretty quickly, not for them, but for faculty and staff, where faculty and staff didn't feel as safe being open and out. We were really kind of behind in terms of our policies to secure the rights and safety for faculty and staff. So I think it's about using and working with the folks on campus to support each other, students supporting faculty and staff supporting students, and the whole community thinking about how do we help each other kind of grow up this institution to be a place where we can all prosper here. And both Bruce and both Bruce and Dijrain we're talking about the way that gender and sexuality cuts across all other aspects of ourselves too. And that's a critical piece around how we think about creating student spaces too. So we can't just think about gender and sexuality alone. We have to think about all the other aspects of a person. And if we only think about gender and sexuality, then we will center and normalize certain aspects and forget about all the other parts of a person, and we'll end up with a center or a space that only serves some people and not as many people as we want. So that's another piece. Best practices include, again, this goes along, like, what are all the things that we need to have best practices in? So one of those things is just space. We need to have space for LGBTQIA people. That's metaphorical space, that's actual space, that's academic space, that's all kinds of space. We need to have safety and affirmation in the classroom. So we need folks to be able to study what they want to study and think how they want to think and think about the things that they're interested in. We need to have services that are provided to students around their gender and sexuality, and not just LGBTQIA folks, but folks who don't fall in any place around that spectrum, but they also need to have information about gender and sexuality that is across the spectrum, because there are folks who might grow up and have kids who are also LGBTQIA plus, and it's important for them to know these things about their life and their possibilities of who they might have as children. So we need to have celebration. Celebration is a really important factor that is often left out of queer lives, of LGBTQIA lives, because we are often isolated, and because we don't grow up in families that represent us, that look like us. A lot of the ways that we would normally be celebrated for the steps in life go unrecognized and uncelebrated. So celebrating who we are is a really important piece of affirmation and safety. So one of the things that has sprung up in the United States is a thing called lavender graduation, which is just a graduation where folks get to graduate with other people who are LGBTQIA plus or allies, or folks who just want to graduate and have a good time, because lavender graduation tends to be a pretty good party. So those are some of the best practices, and there are many, many, many more. But I think I'm running up against time, so I want to pass this on.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jen. I know that I asked you too many questions at one point, but I wanted you to really give us your views as well about creating these support groups. And I'm going to ask Dhiren our next question. Dhiren, how do you think an institution can work with students to bring about an acceptance of the LGBTQI plus community? And this is not only on campuses, but also I think within the larger communities, especially families and parents of these students. Dhiren, there you are. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dheeraj, for the question. Harboring on the necessity of sensitization and thinking about campuses, both as residential campuses where you are away from your family and staying there, and to thinking about also students who are day scholar, who after the whole day in the university space, and I'm not talking about right now in COVID times when most of the classes are online, but who have to go back in their families, to the families, their parents, and as Jen mentioned, you might not necessarily receive affirmation everywhere. To think about this, and I want to, can we then sensitize the various actors that are involved here, and to make sure that you can lead a healthy life, an accepting life. And I remember while we were students and what we used to do, we would do, during the time of admissions, we used to start doing admission assistance desk. And knowing very well, not everybody who is coming to seek admission might be able to tell that, oh, fine, I see a rainbow flag out there. I will go there to the desk and acknowledge my presence. But we knew that our presence there as an admission assistance desk would at least make people, new students coming in the campus feel, there are people like us there. We are not alone in this space that we are coming. Right. I remember an instance, some of the students, queer students, decided we wanted to throw a film festival that celebrates queer cultures, queer histories, makes an inroad within the popular culture of the university space that, there's so much diversity around sexuality and gender identity. And we sought permission from the cultural secretary of the university, and we got the permission. Now, when the posters came out, some of the images in the posters, which were also the posters of the films that we were showcasing, would say two boys kissing, or like, they are shirtless. Now, the very visual of these images would then startle the administration to think about, what kind of things are we teaching our young students? We would go from class to class campaigning, please come, faculty, students, please come and watch these films that we are trying to show so that we can actually start a dialogue somewhere. And as soon as we would finish a campaign, the faculty who was teaching, especially in undergrad classes, would interrupt and say, no, what kind of love are you talking about? The only kind of love that the students who are often infantilized, even in higher education institutions, are told that only kind of love they need to understand is the love between siblings, the love what parents have for their children. Now think about queer people who have often felt isolated from that love, who often felt that love was unavailable. What I feel, what institutions need to do here is then to think about who are in these spaces of power. Who is the cultural secretary? Is the cultural secretary even sensitized around many of these issues? Is the cultural secretary or the people in the equal opportunity cell or the people in the gender sensitization committee, are they sensitized about the issues that we are fighting for, or the communities, the diversities, and the social locations that we are thinking about? Can we have workshops being organized by the university? Can we have parents come and participate in those spaces? Can we have funding mechanisms that if students or faculty or anybody who wants to organize something, initiate something, that can be facilitated? Is there a space, as Jen mentioned, both metaphorical space and a physical space where, if one wants to hold together and come together and collectivize, that is possible? When we were students, in lack of any of these kinds of institutional support, all we used to do is take somebody's hostel room, who had a full hostel room to themselves and secretly organize meetings there and cry and share and find love with each other. Now, can we go beyond that stage? In a time post 2018 Supreme Court verdict, can we really see the change happening? How far can administration can create institutional setups? How can we lead that sensitization from that classroom, from curriculum? What Bruce mentioned, departments, emergence of departments, to thinking about in our homes where we are going back to, that there's a dialogue possible, there's a change possible in all of this.
Thanks, Dhiren. And I think you brought up again a key word for our conversation today, which is sensitization. This is part of my next question for Bruce, but also I'm going to bring in one of our audience members' questions because it connects well with what I wanted Bruce to maybe shed some light on. So Bruce, the question that I had for you is, in your opinion, what kind of commitment and at what level is this commitment needed? Is required to make this work successful, and how do you sensitize the institution to the needs of the community? I'm going to add one of our audience questions to this for you, and our audience member mentioned that while support groups in campuses is one thing, but counseling of staff and faculty is also important to sensitize everyone at a much younger level, maybe about gender issues. So maybe if you can, help answer our audience members' question while you, think about what I asked you as well.
You give me a difficult question there, but well, let me start with the audience question and go back to the other question. In terms of should we start younger, I would say yes. I think it's important that issues of LGBTQI community or understanding of LGBTQI community start earlier, understanding of sexual identity, understanding of gender identity, some of the realities that the communities face are really critical. So I would say yes to that question. In terms of the initial question, I think there's a huge commitment. I mentioned before that many of the centers in the US started out of protests or started out of people doing climate studies that said, gee, there's a lot that's happening within the LGBTQI community. We need to provide support for students and on the campus. And so a lot of this support really is surrounding funding from a higher level. I'm not exactly sure in terms of structures in India schools, but in the US, usually the student affairs side is normally the area that kind of supports LGBTQI offices. On this campus, it's our diversity, equity, and multicultural affairs that this center is under. But you usually need a higher level institutional departmental support for this to be successful. So you can hire professional staff folks to work in the center, specifically a director with a counseling background that could advocate for students to deal with advocacy, as well as provide training. Our center has a library, we do programming, we do academic support. We also do sensitizing of the community through educational programs and information to the community. So there's that whole combination of supporting the individual, but also supporting the campus in understanding LGBTQI issues.
Thank you for that, Bruce. I think you helped answer a question, like the question really, really well. I'm going to move to an interesting question, and I think this is something we brought up several times as we've had this discussion through all three of our panelists, and that's about mindset. That's about how we can help make change, not only within the institution, but also within the community. And I'm going to ask Dhiren this question maybe. Dhiren, in your personal experience, what do you think is the main driver for change in society's mindset for the LGBTQI plus community? I know, decriminalization and the 2018 judgment was important, but the change of mindset really didn't happen with just overnight with that, and there needs to be a process for it. Was it just this change in law? Was it an influence of others? Was it a change in cultural norms? And what do you think is more influential, maybe of law or culture, and what needs to be changed today, going forward, at least where our Indian education institutions are concerned?
Thank you, Dheeraj, for that question. Especially in aftermath of the 2018 historical verdict, where Section 377 was read down by the Honorable Supreme Court, I have a very interesting story, and it's a story from a fieldwork of a fellow academic who teaches at University of California, Santa Barbara, and they were doing the fieldwork around Lucknow and in Uttar Pradesh, and they were doing a focus group discussion including Kotis, trans people, and it was a focus group discussion just to understand how did they feel once now that the law, which is Dheeraj had mentioned earlier, a 19th century law with stranded Victorian morality, now it has been stuck down. How do you feel? For a good chunk of the time when this question was raised in that focus group discussion, there was a lull of silence. Nobody responded. After a while, somebody very timidly, a Koti person, just raised their hand to say, is it some kind of a bus service that the government has started for us? A bus service. I want to remind us that for the longest period of time, nobody in the Indian queer political movement even knew about Section 377. It was brought into the picture to enable a kind of mobilization of a rather stranded community, a community which would not necessarily know the lexicon of LGBTQIA politics, but would otherwise live sexuality in myriad of different ways without being trapped into this framework of identity. And what the law did was it allowed you to then constitute that community to say vis-a-vis law, vis-a-vis the governance mechanism that, we exist and we deserve rights, we be treated like humans. And as citizens of this nation state, of whatever constitution provides us, we all deserve to have equal share of it. And that's how law became central to the queer imagination, only to the extent that it allowed that kind of mobilization. That you could go to the courtroom and in 2018 verdict, that one of the judges would say, history owes an apology. History owes an apology to all LGBT people, to the parents of LGBT people for the kind of oppression and oppressive framework that they had struggled and survived through. And that's that. So to me, law in itself is not going to show you the translation in the social space to also understand that the largest number of people who would actually get impacted by a law like Section 377 would be working class people, people who would then be classified into men who have sex with men, who are cruising on the street, trans people, Kotis, mostly coming from lower caste and working class backgrounds, who would be harassed by the police on the behest of that law, would face trauma and struggles in everyday life. Trans sex worker on the street would be questioned that, what are you doing in the street? And not just about this particular law, but other sets of law that continue to harass queer people and queer people who come from other marginalized social locations, right? So on one hand, you need legal changes, but you also need to see what kind of social changes or what kind of cultural changes it can trigger. And in both of them will have to go hand in hand. One cannot happen in isolation of the other. And how do we do it? Can we create more popular culture around it? Can we not just restrict our imagination to what we are seeing on Bollywood screens? Can we think about regional cinema? Can we think about other modes of protest and literature that is coming from different kind of political movements? How anti-caste political movement is talking about queerness now, which is able to reach to lower quarters of smaller towns and villages and talk about queerness in a different language, not necessarily which is which is prevalent and known in tier 1 cities. So think about law and the limitations of law, because in itself, what happens in the courtroom often stays within the courtroom or amongst people who can read, understand, debate around it. But how are social lives lived, how is everydayness, queerness is experienced, might often fail to be captured in this scheme.
I agree with you. What happens in the courtroom normally stays in the courtroom. But I think this judgment of Section 377 was also, it helped take things away from the courtroom and let a lot of these conversations get mainstreamed. Just a personal opinion. I totally agree with you, though. I'm going to ask this next question to Jen. Jen, in your opinion, how important is it to have LGBTQI plus support groups? And I know you started one of, something almost 20 years back. How important it is to have these support groups on a campus? And what are the first steps that an institution can really take towards creating such a space? Because in India, as Dhiren mentioned, tier 2, tier 3 cities, we're still coming to grips with, just recognizing these needs. So, what are those first easy, maybe baby steps that can be taken towards reaching a stage where you can create such spaces?
Well, I think they're critical when folks have experienced such isolation around a part of their identity, when there's such silence about a part of who we are. It creates a separation in ourselves, and not just in ourselves, but a separation in ourselves and then a separation from other people. And to heal that, we need community. We really need community. And one of the things that we get from our families and from our communities, the people around us, is we get reflected back to us who we are over and over and over again, and from childhood, on up. And it's the way that we learn how to cope with life, how to make decisions, how to become, strong adults, all of that. We learn that from our families and from our communities. And when we don't have that around a particular part of ourselves, it's we can become actually kind of stunted around that. And for a lot of us who don't get any really good information about gender and sexuality, and we've had that piece be isolated, it actually can make some of our development take a little bit longer. For instance, so I'm 50, and so in the United States, people around my age, we kind of grew up in a time when there wasn't a lot of great information about gender and sexuality. And so when I was a young person, we really didn't talk about LGBTQIA young people. We really only started talking about, LGBTQIA folks when they were like 20 or older. And so it was as if, you didn't exist until you became an adult. So I didn't really get a lot of good information until I was an adult. Well, by that time, I had already gone through my adolescence, and I didn't know anything about myself as a sexual person, as a gendered person. And so I had gone through this whole part of my life where dating and becoming a gendered person had happened, and I didn't know how to do any of that. And so I really did that as a 20 and a 30-year-old. What these support groups give us is that reflection that we are missing out on in our families, that we're missing out on in our communities. It gives us a space where we can actually see ourselves, and we can see possibility for ourselves. We can see life for ourselves. We can see ourselves reflected back in others, and we can give that to each other, and we can heal some of that has been broken. And it's a place that sometimes has to feel and be secretive for a while. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's okay until culture shifts happen and until there's enough movement that then we can take that further and further. It also helps us build up our confidence, and then we can help shift the culture too. So that's another reason those places are really sacred and important, because it builds us up to help be culture changers.
Thank you for that, Jen. I think your experience really will help a lot of our administrators here in India as they think about, first steps towards creating these, conversations on campus. So, today over these past just 8 questions, can you imagine? We've run through so much. We've talked about policy and law. We've talked about support and community. We've talked about inclusiveness. We've talked about sensitivity and sensitizing and educating. But more important, I think we've energized ourselves with a lot of questions as well, first step questions that are important. And I have quite a few from our audience members, who are sometimes responding to something that we're talking about, or just curious, or trying to learn something that maybe we've not been able to address in these next 60 minutes. So I'm going to take a little bit of time now to maybe ask our panelists to help answer some of the questions that our audience members have posed to us as a group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just call on either one of our 3 panelists to help answer, and I'm going to try and club some of these questions just for want of time. And these are, the first question, and for this I'd like to maybe ask Bruce for his opinion. Some of our audience members, these are some of the questions that they've asked is, how do I recognize someone from the LGBT community? Somebody else has asked, and it's a similar question, my friend is from the community, but society is not accepting this person. What should such a person do when, confronted with such an antagonizing atmosphere, I guess. And the third is again from an audience member asking the question on behalf of this person's friend. The friend is not sure of her gender, and she's only 21. She's a young lady from a tier 2 city in India, presently in college. What advice would you give to such a person who is still not sure of her gender or her identity?
Well, I guess in the first 2 questions, what I hear is sort of a conversation about being an ally, and how do I support a friend who may be going through the process of understanding their gender identity or sexual identity, So, I think there's a couple of things. One, it sounds almost like the person might also need to find out more information about sexual and gender identity so that they can be an effective ally. There's a lot of resources. I know that there's resources that are being shared through GLSEN and some other sources that will help in terms of trying to understand that even our university, in terms of Indiana University or LGBTQ plus center, there should be a link that's there. There's an exploration of gender and sexual identity. There's some videos, et cetera. So I think some of that, there's resources out there that can help initially understand that, as well as encouraging the friends who may be struggling around those issues to reach out to some of those centers. Like, for example, our center, while it's in the US, we have a lot of information on the website. People can reach out to us and we can still provide information. The other piece too, I think the other question is, if someone's trying to come out, how do you help them come out? You kind of need to let them do it on their own in some regards. I think they're kind of indicating to you and demonstrating some level of trust, but we also have to give them space to actually come out on their gender or sexual identity at the time that they're ready as well.
Thank you, Bruce. This next question I'm going to ask Dhirain to help answer. It's from one of our audience members who asks, what can parents do to support their child who is confused with their sexuality?
Now, it's a very interesting question. What can parents do? But it's also about, I was thinking, and it resounds with what the history of political that would run for longest. I'm going to club with another question that popped up in the Q&A box. It was save our children. The fear of our children being recruited, our children being put into where LGBTQIA, this metrics is seen as dangerous recruitment scandal where our children are going to be far flown away from the standard heteronormative family unit. I feel a lot of parents, and it's like, you know, are also unaware of a lot of things that are happening with the children's life, given that they're themselves surrounded by the heteronormative metrics. How does one enable parents? I've seen a lot of queer support groups when we were students would tend to also organize, like, you know, we will get a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, and there would be a sensitization session where parents of LGBTQI children would be invited to engage with their concerns, why they're not able to accept, etc., etc. I just want to club this aspect of how far can parents accept it, and it's a journey that they will have to take. It's not going to be a switch on, switch off button, right? It's not going to like suddenly you light up switch on a button, an electric bulb will lighten up, and everything would be going to be hunky dory. No, it's a process of their own unlearning. That they have the training that they have gone into, where the training is about heteronormativity. The training, you know, there are only 2 sets of sex gender system. The training, you know, every child has to get married, has to reproduce, has to be sewn into the patrilineal caste setup. That freeing will take time, and that freeing will take efforts from all the other factors. There's another question, if Dheeraj allows me here to respond to here in continuation of Save the Children, was a complaint that was filed by the National Commission of Protection of Children in India against a book which was being published, a course manual that was published by NCERT last year. Which then is a manual that will be circulated in different schools across the country because it's government run, especially in public universities, public schools, etc., to talk about what to do if while you're exploring a gender identity, what ways in which you can understand gender very well if one is going to gender dysphoria, etc., etc. The National Commission meant for protection of children stayed an order against this manual and said you can't teach such things. You're actually questioning the natural order of things. Like you're encouraging students to learn different things, and they will start doing things which they should not be doing. Of all the people who were involved in preparing this manual was taken off from the official website of the National Council of Education, Research and Training, was taken off. The one person was part of the committee who were writing this manual, one who was targeted was a trans friend. And that public life, their private life was put into scrutiny, saying, you know, these kind of people who wear this kind of clothes, who are like, look like this, or who talk about sexuality and desire in this particular fashion, is the one who are going to torment and change the mindset of the young children, your young children. Are you ready to make that happen? Now, see what all is happening. On one hand, we are trying to create an environment, a social climate, which can be accepting, a social change that can facilitate easy acceptance by parents, trying to make changes in curriculum, etc., but they're all contesting. Now, in what political grammar, in what social landscape are we trying to bring those changes? And how far can we fight? How far the parents can fight? So somewhere in big cities, as Dheeraj had mentioned, there might be parents who might be accepting of the children now, maybe after watching Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan, that Ayushman Khurrana film. There are also hesitations. There are also unlearning. I have personally witnessed, in smaller towns, there might be more acceptance, maybe not in the similar language, but are often also scrutinized. So think much more differently. Who are these political actors? Who are the ones who want that change to happen? Change in what direction? And how can we constructively, collectively imagine that? Allow fans to unlearn, allow students, children to be also able to understand themselves and bring about that change. Sorry if I took long.
No problem at all. And I think an important thing, as you rightly said, is to unlearn is also as important as learning something new. I'm going to ask Jen the next questions. Again, it's a set of 2 questions, and I know we've got many more questions that we can answer. But Jen, this one of our audience members asks, how can I bring up a conversation about LGBTQI plus issues with a staff member or with peer students who are not part of the community? And there's another question, again, from one of our audience members about how do LGBTQI plus students keep heart and soul together when the campus administration does nothing towards sensitization? I think these kind of work well together. If you can maybe help answer this. The audience member also mentions that in context of India, campuses are still turning a blind eye towards the community, while campuses do, and they try and advocate homogeneity, kind of what Dhirendra mentioned, if not by words, then by actions.
Right. And I was seeing that some of the things that folks are facing in India are similar to some of the tropes that we faced in the U.S. that there's this fear of pedophilia connected with being gay, and so a lot of these things we've definitely faced here as well. These are difficult conversations, and so some of them I think that it's important to also. I mean, there's irony here because I am a white person here talking about decolonization, but I think that it's really important to call upon your history pre-colonization and to talk about Indian culture pre-colonization, because what really colonization is a lot of what created what we have now around gender and sexuality around the globe. And so that's part of what has happened, is that white people and Christianity created this binary gender and heteropatriarchy. And so now we are all sort of stuck with it around the world. But that's not what India was experiencing pre-colonization. So some of it is drawing upon that, I think. I know that's a really big conversation. And when you're going to talk to a colleague, that's probably not where you want to start, but I wanted to mention that. But when you're going to talk to a colleague, I think that there are ways that you can make connections around ways that maybe they have felt not like part of a group. I mean, I think that it's sometimes easy to talk about why having safe spaces, or why creating affirming spaces for LGBTQI folks is important by making connections with other people around how they might have felt left out, or how they might have felt not important, or how they might have felt not seen or not affirmed, and help them draw comparisons. And then that can help them understand, oh yeah, maybe I've experienced something similar, even though it's not the same thing. So I think that's one way. I think another way is to really find people who are your allies, who are not LGBTQIA, but who can talk about this in very clear and comfortable ways and have them be particular leaders within the campus. Because often they can talk about things that really LGBTQIA people just cannot have those same conversations without really being targeted. So I think that's also a critical piece to take up. So I think that's where I would leave that.
Thank you, Jen. Bruce, I'm going to ask you the next, again, it's a set of 2 questions. We've got so many questions to cover, so I'm trying to club similar questions. How do you feel, this is a question from, again, a couple of our audience members. How can closeted queer people be supported because they might not benefit from visible queer events? And a similar question is, how can I, being a closeted gay man, bring an indirect conversation with parents about LGBTQI plus topic in order to know their stance on this topic, as this can be critical to know for a closeted person on when to come out to parents?
Again, difficult questions. I think one of the things that I would say is that, and it depends on if you have an organization or a department or even student groups. I think creating spaces where events are not solely LGBTQ so that it feels like I have to be LGBTQ to participate. You know, a lot of times when we're dealing with communities that are not totally out, you create programs where you say they're more generalized, but we're addressing LGBTQ issues, how to be effective ally, you know, and how do you support the community. So it kind of gives an individual the out that I'm here because I'm an ally, even though they're part of the community, but they can say that they're ally. But if it's specific for LGBTQ plus, it forces them to come out. So it's really about who's doing the programming to kind of create a space for people that are closeted to also benefit from the programming. The other angle in terms of that is you can also look at kind of encouraging folks to utilize like online resources that really doesn't cause a person to physically come into a center or come into a space that's LGBTQ specific and still benefit from that. You know, in terms of dealing with folks that might be insensitive to LGBTQ or trying to gauge LGBTQ issues, you know, I think one of the things you can do is, I don't know specifically in India, but I know in the US, there's a lot of media shows that are out there that are LGBT specific, you know, and maybe watching that show or asking someone, have you seen this show? You know, what do you think about it? So you're not necessarily coming out, but what you're doing is you're kind of gauging how they're reacting to a program. For example, there's a program in the US called Pose. I don't know if that's in India, but have you seen Pose? What do you think about that? You know, and it kind of covers HIV, it covers gender identity, LGBTQ issues, but just mentioning it will also kind of get a sense of how people might respond.
I think with OTT in India as well, there are several shows now that do touch upon these topics very directly. And I think that's a great idea of a way to bring up a conversation, especially for those who are closeted. We have a lot of questions. I only have time for one more, and I'm going to invite Dhirain for this last set of questions. And this is to deal with binary issues. So Dhirain, classrooms in India are usually divided into only 2, boys and girls. And this goes on to influence policies, dress codes, opportunities. What is the alternative that we can propose to us as a step towards understanding and awareness? And a similar question is, how can the reproductive and sexual rights of the queer students be secured, keeping the binary supremacy prevailing in campuses in mind? I think they're pretty well connected. Jen and Bruce touched upon just one small thing like bathrooms, but I think there's a lot more, and it's a very deep and difficult question, like a lot of the others. I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer this last question before we go to closing remarks.
I think the structure wants to deliberately homogenize everything, homogenize into an image which is conducive to itself, which allows it to maintain the status quo of power. And one way in which power attained is through the institution of gender. Why gender is so important in all walks of our lives. Is it really that important the way it is made important to feel? So one was, in most of our houses in India, which if you're not super rich and you lived with multiple people in the same house, you did not necessarily had one gents toilet and one ladies toilet, right? You used to have a common toilet, which everybody in the family would use. But as soon as you go into those spaces, in public life, you tend to be divided on the counts of, this is where men should urinate, this is where women should urinate, and they're the only two framings that we are familiar with. So anybody outside this realm are bound to struggle and suffer, right? Another way is through uniforms that Dheeraj was mentioning, right? Why everybody, boys have to wear this, girls have to wear this. There was an interesting, in one of these OTT platforms, in Netflix, if I'm not wrong, sex education in the recent season talks elaborately around this question. What happens to students who feel dysphoric? Thinking about that, how the standardized logic of binary system is trying to label themselves and put into these boxes. The struggle is grand. You as individuals, we can't fight this big system, but we can bring out smaller changes. Acknowledging very well that our social lives, despite the fact they might look similar, might not be not exactly be the same. So the remedies in those situations might also have to be different. In a classroom setup, as a teacher who also talks about queerness, talks about gender, talks about sexuality in the classroom, we often find that students who have been trained into thinking in particular ways are finding themselves struggling with these newer ideas that we are trying to float in the classrooms. Right? How does one, so therefore what I'm saying is how can one manage an openness to that conversation? I am here knowing very well, as Jen mentioned, that a lot of this knowledge around sex, gender, binary system is a colonial leftover. It is very white. It is coming from a particular form of understanding, and it was made to manage itself the way. Let me give you a very historical anecdote here. So Britishers come, they bring in whatever Section 377, but also bring in Criminal Tribes Act. Now, what they were struggling with is that, in our understanding, it's like men and women, who are these people who are neither this, neither that? Who are these people whom we are not able to compartmentalize and box them into this particular figurines? So the first case, which was under Section 377, which was actually criminalized, was against a trans person called Khairati in Allahabad High Court, the erstwhile Allahabad High Court under the colonial rule. And police would follow this person, and was that this person cross dresses, this person is violating, and therefore it's an anomaly in their understanding. Let's start with thinking that the way in which the system and society is given to us is already anomalous. And by putting it right, by accepting, making room for the diversity in the classroom, and not readily dividing it like a hostel mess where boys sit here and girls sit there. They allow this kind of gender segregation that we follow only to a time when you're grown up and reach puberty and crossing it in a marriageable age, and suddenly your parents are all about, Now you should not stay separate. You now need to marry each other, and we will choose whom you need to get married. And then you have to reproduce children. Like, think about the very core, this idea is flawed. And to the core, it is there just to maintain a status quo of power. And moment we start questioning in our limitedness, in our everyday life, in our classroom, in our domestic spaces, we might be able to challenge collectively, if not individually, some of these systemic power problems.
Thank you, Dhiren. We're running out of time, and I know we have a lot more questions. What I feel the success in a conversation of this sort is that we leave with more questions than when we came in, because that means we've learned something, we're curious about things. And I can tell you we still have another 10 or 15 questions in the chat box that we are unable to even get to, and I apologize for that. What I'd like to do before we close today is maybe just ask our three panelists to come back with a short 1 minute crisp reflection on what they would like our audience as a takeaway. And I'm going to request this in the exact opposite order that I introduced our panelists. So maybe if Dhiren and then Bruce and then Jen just speak one after the other. Short 1 minute, just your closing remarks, what you would like our audience to take away at the end of this discussion.
What I would do is, rather than giving statements, I would just read a poem, if that's allowed. Something that I wrote when I was a student studying in a school in a small town where I grew up, where I thought I was the only queer person around. I did not even know what queer meant, what gay meant at all. But this is something that I wrote then, so it's and I thought this would be interesting to just repeat it here. My friend, we are no alien race. My friend, we are no alien race. To each one, we are strangers though. These fears are one that we both face, and tears that make us both feel low. Then why do you disown me, friend? Then why do you disown me, friend? What makes you think I'm human, not? Why do you feel my life should end, and why do you think my soul should rot? Different, I know we are so unlike. But is this reason enough, you tell, to make this world different to me and make my life a living hell? You call me names, you pelt me stones. You kill my heart or break my bones, I'll question not. I'll question not, for your face does show. My truth questions the truth you know. And this is that fear that lies inside. Why did I tell? Why just not hide? Why did I tell? Why just not hide?
How do I follow that? But nice. I just wanted to say that in terms of how we began with some of the key statistics that are impacting the LGBTQI community is actually the piece that will help you empower the change. It's just clear that LGBTQI students are facing challenges, and that's your argument to encourage support for that population. Thank you for having me.
Dhiren and Bruce, both of you are just incredible, and thank you for having me. And the thing I want to say is LGBTQIA people, or as I like to say, queer and trans and non-binary people, are really just kind of magical. I mean, look at Dhiren and Bruce. And so we're missing out as a culture if we don't see that.
Wow. I don't know if I could top either of those three, but it's important that we close today with we've closed today with three such powerful statements, I think, from the lovely poem by Dhiren, Bruce's comments, and then, Jen's recognition of the beauty of being different. I'd like to thank Mr. Scott Ticknor, our Deputy Consul General. He gave us some really invigorating starting thoughts, which really led through this entire hour and a half. And also he stayed in to listen in on the entire conversation itself. I want to personally thank Jen, Bruce, and Dhiren, our three great panelists who provided perspective, who provided their time, and who provided a lot of information as hopeful starting points for all of you. I want to thank Shreya for sure. She's been silent, but she's been working those hands for the past 90 minutes to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible in this conversation. I want to ensure that I recognize our back-end teams, both at the University of Notre Dame as well as the US Consulate, who've made this possible and who've made this platform possible, who've brought us all together. But most importantly, I think I want to thank all of you, our audience, for having an open mind, for instilling so many great questions and invigorating so much of thought for all of us to go away, I think, as I said earlier, with more questions than answers, which means we are more curious than we were earlier. We are more interested in understanding. We are more, we're questioning things. We're questioning roles. We're questioning society. But at the same time, we're trying to be more inclusive. I think that's the key takeaway that we should have from here is that, different is not always bad. Different is, as our closing remarks from our speaker said, different is valuable, and it should be, we need to try and inculcate that within all our campuses and universities. I want to thank all of you again for the second in our series. We will have a third panel discussion sometime in March 2022. Again, on a topic in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I look forward to having all of you as an engaged audience then as well. Stay tuned for our email. And once again, thank you and good night or good morning, wherever you are in this world. Namaste.